In this series of lectures and in the courses that I teach at the university, I'm all about efficiency. Efficiency compares the cost and the benefit. You want to have maximum benefit for a minimum amount of cost. But sometimes, in order to reach very unique achievements, to excel, to do things that others cannot do, you need to work very, very hard. You need to do something very special. Here, you're not speaking about efficiency. You're speaking about effectiveness. Efficiency is about the connection between your means, the effort that you give, and the result. Effectiveness is putting a very, very high result and saying, I'm going to reach it, while others are not going to get even close. That's effectiveness. You're not concerned with the cost. You try to reach an effect that is very great. Now, usually, this means, according to my philosophy, doing more of the same, at least in a smart way, which means if everybody else spends 2 hours a day, you spend 4 hours a day studying, writing, and so on. You need to be smart, you need to improve, but the amount of effort is very, very important. The amount of effort gives usually decreasing returns. So as you get close to the maximum level of hours that you spend, the returns go smaller, but they still accumulate and they can get you to the point of excellence that you want to reach. But sometimes there are certain things that lead to this effectiveness, that lead to greatness, but they are different than most of what you do in the rest of the time. And for me, this unique thing is Shakespeare. Shakespeare allows you to do what I call grasp the soul of the English language, to get very, very deep into the ideas that form this language and the culture that infuses it. And this will lead you to great points of excellence. It requires a lot of effort, but the reward is very great. My name is Shai Dotan. I'm Associate Professor of International Public Law at the University of Copenhagen Faculty of Law. And the purpose of these lectures is to help you improve your English and your research skills. The first and the most important reason why you should read Shakespeare if you want to excel in writing and presenting in English is because every single one of the authors that worked in the English language after Shakespeare have read him and learned from him. Even if the author decides to go in a different way, rebel against him, he's always in some form of a relationship with Shakespeare. Let's take an example that maybe explains why reading Shakespeare is so important. If you read the great book, A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, it's a story that is dystopia, describes a world that is focused on technological advancement and on trying to avoid suffering and ugliness and old age as much as possible. In this world, there is a reserve where some people try to preserve old values and they live almost like barbarians. And one of the things that they cherish the most is Shakespeare. Now, if you understand that Shakespeare is an important author, you get the point of the idea. As you read through the book, you can find a lot of quotes from Shakespeare inside the text. If you read them carefully and reflect on them, you will learn even better. Now, you can try to research a little bit further. Google it, ask ChatGPT about quotes and how they relate to each other, and this will give you a good idea of what the author is trying to think about. But what about all the other thousands of possibilities where Aldous Huxley could have referred to Shakespeare and chose not to do so? What about all the quotes that never appear in the book? You will never know that because you don't understand the inner workings of the mind of Aldous Huxley. Now, unless you research him and read biographies of him and read all his work, etc., you'll probably not get very, very far in this direction. But the first step you can take is read at least the main plays of Shakespeare and all of his sonnets, and this will give you a good idea of what a man like Aldous Huxley would find in Shakespeare. Would he find the way King Lear describes old age relevant? Would he find the way Macbeth describes the phenomena of sin and crime relevant? Would he find the musings in the strange story of Hamlet relevant? What exactly is it that draws him to Shakespeare? What did he learn from him? All these things you can learn only by reading Shakespeare himself, and then you can try to appreciate the relationship that Aldous Huxley had to Shakespeare. And the same is true for every author. Doesn't matter which gender, doesn't matter which age, doesn't matter if he was writing in the US or in the UK or in any other country that is an English-speaking country, or of course if he's from a multilingual and come from a different origin. All these things don't matter. Shakespeare relates to all of them. Now, you would tell me, so what is your Shakespeare story? How do you relate to Shakespeare? I mean, I mentioned a few plays. Did it have an important effect on your life? Well, as a matter of fact, it did. Even though I come from Israel, even though I didn't know a single word in English until I was 9, and my English when I was 20 was terrible, full of mistakes, very, very bad. I'm not even a fiction writer. And yet I can tell you that I have my own Shakespeare story, and you're going to hear it now. So, when I was serving in the army, in the Israeli Defense Forces, I used to serve in an area that required several buses to get to, and I used to get there very, very early in the morning. And I had the privilege of going to a bookstore that I really liked and could buy books relatively cheaply. And I started to read books, and I was moving basically from book to book to book. One of the books, I don't recall if it was from there or from the library next to my home, that I read during these long bus trips, was a book by Yesaya Berlin that was speaking about the roots of the Enlightenment. And it has a very interesting thesis. It says the Enlightenment was actually connected directly to the Romanticism, its great antagonist. And if people, after Kant, started to speak about Romanticism, it's because Kant destroyed the original order that existed before him. And this started to get me interested in some of the Romanticism in Germany. Again, long story, but I'm getting to Shakespeare very, very quickly. And then one of the books that I took was from a library in my hometown, in Ramat Sharon. The book was a book called The Apprenticeship of Wilhelm Meister by Goethe, the great German author. And I started to read the book. I don't think I liked it so much. I didn't really understand what was the point about it. There were several things that were enchanting for me. For example, the book starts with a story about a guy who looked at a picture that had a very great significance for him as a child. And he goes for a journey to find this picture, something that already when I was in the army, so 20 years ago, I could easily find a picture like this in Google in a few seconds. So the entire journey is about this. This was, I later learned, one of the greatest Bildungsroman ever written. So a story of intellectual apprenticeship, just like the story that I'm telling now was my intellectual apprenticeship. The book describes this situation like this. Anyway, the main protagonist in the book goes to a group of actors that are traveling actors. They go from city to city, and then they give him the first play of Shakespeare. He starts to read, and he just gets crazy. He cannot stop reading Shakespeare. He locks himself in a castle somewhere in Germany. I like to think of this as a castle in Heidelberg, which is a very prominent castle that I really like to look at when I was there. Locks himself there and reads all of Shakespeare cover to cover. Now, this would definitely not be enough to convince me to read Shakespeare. I had many other books to read. My English was very, very bad. But now I go back in history to a story about my grandfather. My grandfather lived in what was then Yugoslavia, and at the time, during the Second World War, this area was conquered by the Nazis, and the family managed to survive by agreeing to basically give the business to to a non-Jew, and they did work that was important for the infrastructure of the country, so they managed to live through the conflict. But one of the things that happened that made my grandfather very sad was that some kind of a Nazi collaborator showed up unexpected one day at the door and just relieved the family of all of its library. It was a very rich family. They had a lot of books that were very, very expensive books that my grandfather loved, and took all the books. Fortunately enough, there were a group of old and plays of Shakespeare. By old, I mean they were printed in a cheap printing in Leipzig. Already then they were more than 100 years old, or about 80 years old, or something like this. So some of them were printed about the beginning of the middle of the 18th century. Now Leipzig, just so you know, we Jews always used to say about if a good comes from Leipzig, it's a great good. It's an excellent quality. And even though we were really, you would see that they were very, very cheap and basic notebooks, they were perfect. The only problem was that there was somebody in the family who wanted to be an actor, which in a Jewish family is not considered a great honor usually. So she was kind of viewed as the black sheep of the family, and she used to write on all the books comments to herself. This man came, he found these really cheap books full with notes. He didn't pick them up. So my grandfather had nothing to read besides Shakespeare throughout most of the war, and that's what he did. He knew very little English before that, and that's how he taught himself English. He basically read all of Shakespeare's plays. Now I said, now if I read this in a book by Goethe, and my grandfather did it, then I will do the same. Okay, I'm going to have very long bus drives. Sometimes I'm going to be left in the base at night, nothing to do, no smartphones to play with, no television to watch. I'm just going to read Shakespeare. And this was a revelation for me. I took it with me to court. I read between the discussions, and I can remember sometimes which book did I read when, and how it affected my behavior and how it affected my emotions. So you see, I have a Shakespeare story, even me, that is not a great author. And I can guarantee you that if you ask any great author in the English language, they will have a story like this. Sometimes we say that they hated Shakespeare and rebelled against him. Sometimes they fell in love with him in this age or the other, but they all connected to him. And that's why Shakespeare is key to everything. But then, of course, you may ask me, why are everybody so enthusiastic about Shakespeare? Is it just a matter of a chance or luck? Well, partly it is that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think there are many great authors, and I think maybe Shakespeare is one of the greats, but there are others that are also potentially could have risen to such an iconic view. So history does have a part in it. But there are several other issues that I think are unique and make Shakespeare great. So let me name just a few. One is the language. The language in Shakespeare is beautiful and memorable. You can memorize specific phrases easily because the language is just so aesthetic. And there are many levels to this aestheticism. I think partly it's because it's a language that comes in a particular time in history, right after what is called the Great Vowel Shift that made English more similar to what we use today. So it's not an easy read for somebody reading nowadays. There are some words that they will not know. There are some words that they would know that have a slightly different meaning. I enjoyed also reading Shakespeare with some kind of a professional book that would also have notes and explain how the words mean something different than today, or mean a little bit, or describe the meaning in today's terms. So that's the fact that the language is different enough to be exotic, and at the same time similar enough to be readable is an advantage. In addition to that, Shakespeare was a genius in the use of language. So he used phrases that are just incredibly aesthetic and beautiful. And part of the aestheticism of language has to do with the way he wrote these plays. He wrote all of them in the iambic pentameter. So he is a particular metric that is used. And that's something that I never noticed directly as I was reading. Maybe I'm not musical enough. but I noticed that the sentences kind of flow one after each other in a very particular way. And I think, writing in exactly iambic pentameter seems like something that is very, very difficult to do unless you're an expert, but kind of mimicking the cadence of a sentence is something that I very much care about. And I think that as you write, even if you write non-fiction, then cadence is very, very important in English. So the meter that you're using, the stress of the syllables that creates some kind of music is very, very important and makes a very big difference. I think in the sonnets also you see a very rigid structure and just beautiful language. So again, it's a rich language. You use a variety of metaphors and techniques that make it just a great beauty to read. I'm not going to attempt in this short video to go through examples, so you just have to go through and start to look at these plays for yourself to check how the language and the iambic pentameter work together. What I can speak a little bit more about in this short time is about two other things. So one is the characters that make Shakespeare's plays. I will start by something that always was intriguing for me. Another one of my favorite playwrights is George Bernard Shaw, who was also a genius and wrote beautiful plays. And he also used to write very, very detailed epilogues and prologues to his plays, where he wrote basically scientific theses about the topic of a play. And in one of his theses that he wrote about Shakespeare, and he said, no one would care to lose his hat in the rain for one of his characters. And that's something that I always found very, very strange, because the characters in Shakespeare are incredibly relatable. So I don't think anybody that knows Shakespeare as well and became old or even start in middle age doesn't think about King Lear and about how frightening it is to become old and fragile, even if you're not completely senile, to lose the vigor of the youth is something very frightening. And King Lear can show that beautifully. I don't think anybody ever felt jealous and knew Othello but didn't think about that. It's Othello getting jealous without a justified reason, based on a mistake, and doing things that they regret, and the pain that involves with this regret, all these things going to Othello. So he's a very, very iconic character, deep character, relatable character. What I think about what made George Bernard Shaw say this is that when a character leads to a certain level of myth, it becomes really an icon, then maybe it's a bit harder to relate to it as you would relate to a character that does things that are more mundane in a way, that does things that are day-to-day, regular things. And this character, you can say, I can see this as a friend, a relative, I can relate to it more directly. So characters, I think, are a very strong part of the appeal of Shakespeare, how he builds the character, how he gives some depth. And it's very important to understand that every character has multiple layers, and it's a complicated character. So if you take, for example, the character of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, so a Jew that is continuously humiliated until he plans a horrible revenge against a Christian, you would see a character that on one hand may look like evil, spiteful, but on the other hand, you could understand it in a certain way because it was humiliated all his life continuously, and you could understand where this revenge is coming from. And Shakespeare doesn't hide that. He really gives you the ability to see both sides of the characters at the same time. And then also there is the plot, the way the stories are written. Many years before I read Shakespeare's plays in English, I remember that I found a nice book in Hebrew that was designed for kids. It had pictures, and it had a very, very shortened version of Shakespeare's plays in Hebrew, and I found the stories fascinating. By the way, it's not a coincidence. I mean, a lot of these stories are adaptations of stories that existed before. Some are actually stories from history stories. One of the best plays that I ever read of Shakespeare was Julius Caesar. It's an historical play. So he takes stories that already are there or describes something very, very deep about human emotion, and he explains them there. And if you combine all these four things, so if you combine a very strong plot that deals with fundamental things that repeat themselves in every man's life in a variety of ways. We don't have to be kings to feel betrayed like Macbeth, or to feel envy, to feel jealousy, to feel the fear of old age and all these things. We have this capacity to relate to the characters, to the plot. You combine it with the plot with characters that are very deep, that are multiple-sided, that are can be understood in different ways and can be justified or criticized in a variety of ways. And you combine it with a language that is almost putting you in a trance because it's written in a very musical way, and you get something that is irresistible. So these are the plays that made people for hundreds of years affected by them, and that's how they became so iconic to the English language. That's why we say of Shakespeare, he wasn't for an age, but for all times. So, in conclusion, we can say that Shakespeare has this iconic position for a reason. He wrote incredible plays in a great language that made a huge influence. But I still feel a little bit dissatisfaction with the explanation that I gave to you before. Let me explain why. I think if you really think deeply about the situation, you realize that every great author in history always has a Shakespeare story, a relationship to Shakespeare. You would understand the influence that he has. But then, if you ask me, Shai, how much of Shakespeare is there in your first book, or your second book, or your third book? The third book is actually about English, so maybe it's a stronger influence there. But it would be difficult for me to answer that, even for me, to draw deep into my soul and find the connection to Shakespeare. And that's why these deep influences that affect the psyche of the word of the intellect can be left aside for a second when you can focus about very specific things. So let me tell you a story. When the authors of Lion King, the movie, a famous movie, discussed the issue, they didn't know exactly where the story was going. I read this, I think, in a book by Malcolm Gladwell, if I remember correctly, but I couldn't find exactly where. They couldn't find a way to continue the plot until one of the editors just says, you know what? This is Hamlet. This is Hamlet, okay? That's what you were looking for. Yes, a story about a boy that his father was betrayed, almost exactly, betrayed by his father, by his brother, killed. The boy roams the world and cannot find himself inside it until finally the ghost of the father is calling him back to revenge and to regain his glory. He understood all that. Now, you don't need necessarily to read Hamlet to love The Lion King. I watched it as a child when it came out first, and I liked it very, very much, and I'm sure my children will enjoy it as well. But you will not be able to write The Lion King without reading Hamlet. Not in a million years. Not in a million years. Because the entire story gathers from a lot of different aspects and a lot of different issues, and then hits with a myth, with an icon. And this is what Shakespeare will give you. That's exactly the little weapon that you need. And that's why I started with this very boring explanation about effectiveness versus efficiency. Yes, you can be more efficient if you focus on doing targeted writing sessions with an expert, reading style books very effectively. This will get you places. It will. But then if you want to get to the level when you can write a Lion King, you need to invest in the soul of the English language, in learning the classics, understanding them. And Shakespeare is the best example by far that I can bring of how it's done. And this will give you this unique avenue, how you can weave a story, how you can create a movie, write a book. And by the way, the same thing applies with a lesser extent also in other words. Also, if you would try to write a non-fiction book, sometimes a phrase would fit just well, and you could find a way in which Shakespeare helps you to do that. For all those reasons, if you can find the time to invest not in your immediate future, in your far away future, let's say you are in your 20s, you have time on your hands, read Shakespeare, Decades later, this would pay itself and will allow you to excel as a writer and a presenter in English.